Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of VETchat. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Kel O'Neill. For those of you that don't know, Kel is a counsellor, psychotherapist and educator with a special interest in the area of eating disorders. She has spent 15 years working in this field in a variety of roles and is ever passionate about sharing her experiences and using her knowledge for the benefit of others. Kel runs a very busy private practice, delivers a collection of eating disorders CPD programs, contributes to research and other professional projects, as well as curating eating disorder content for both the Mental Health Bites blog and YouTube channel. Kel is also a long-serving ambassador for the eating disorder charity Beat. So welcome, Kel. It's great to have you on VETchat.
Thanks so much for asking me to be here.
So eating disorders are something that I personally never hear too much about in the vet space. We hosted a webinar several years ago with the Royal College, which discussed understanding eating disorders. But for anybody who missed that or isn't familiar, could you start by giving us an overview of what eating disorders are, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So eating disorders is a kind of an umbrella term for a collection of complex mental health difficulties, which are all characterized by significant distress in relation to body image, weight, shape, size, or food, or a combination thereof in different ways. Some of the terminology that people might be familiar with is eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder. So it covers quite a wide range of issues that have those base components of food and or body image being a difficulty. But it's really important that I highlight there that it isn't about vanity. Eating disorders are very much coping mechanisms and are expressions of an individual's emotional struggle and level of distress.
Interesting. And are there certain demographics or groups of people who tend to be affected more by eating disorders?
There is a lot of stereotypes around this when it comes to eating disorders. I think the average person's perception is that eating disorders primarily affect white middle class young girls. And
Yeah.
actually, that absolutely isn't the case at all. We see people from just about any and all walks of life affected by eating disorders. Yes, onset is often during the adolescent years, but I've worked with people, so I work with people from around about the age of 14 up until I've worked with adults in their 80s affected by eating disorders. And we know that about 25% of cases are men, and we know that certain like sub-demographics of society like the LGBTQ society areas might be more affected. So it has, pockets of areas of experience where people are more affected by eating disorders, perhaps related to difficulties around identity or emotional difficulties, but it absolutely can be anybody, and you wouldn't know by looking at somebody that they had an eating disorder.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. And how common are they?
This is a really great question. If you were to look at some of the information leaflets that we often see for charities around eating disorders, for the longest time we've been saying about 1.25 million people in the UK. However, in 2019, there was some research that was disseminated in the NHS's Health Survey for England 2019-2020, and that suggested that around 19% of people over 16 would screen positive. So that would be almost 1 in 5 people potentially struggling with a relationship with food in some way.
Wow, that's a lot more than I was expecting you to say.
Yeah, I think essentially what I often say when I'm talking to groups of people is I would be shocked if you didn't know somebody that was affected, if we think about that level of frequency.
Yeah, no, I am quite shocked by that. I really wasn't expecting you to say that many
Yeah.
people. Okay. So how can it impact a person's life? Because I know in the vet space in particular, you know, we there's a lot of talk around perfectionism. Vets are often high achieving individuals. They put
Mhm.
high expectations on themselves, and it can all be linked to perfectionism. And it can be, that can be quite common and spoken
Mhm.
about quite a lot. Is there a link between that and eating disorders from your experience?
Yes. So you heard me mention before some different types of eating disorders, such as anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating. We
Mm,
know that different types of experiences make a person more likely to be affected by particular types of eating disorders. So that kind of type A, high achieving personality has some proven correlation with specifically anorexia nervosa. Now, that's actually the least common eating disorder, but is the one that people most commonly know about. But in which
mm,
a person might heavily restrict their calorie and nutritional intake, and ultimately that's likely to result in a low body weight and malnutrition. But those environments, any environment really, where a person is under a lot of pressure and expectation, could contribute to any type of eating disorder. Really, we think about them as coping mechanisms, and being in an environment that might be putting a huge amount of that strain and stress on your personal self and that need to
mm.
achieve. But we
Yeah.
do especially see that when it comes to anorexia nervosa.
Yeah. Okay. So how if we move on and talk a little bit about eating disorders and how they can impact a person's life, could you
Mhm.
share some thoughts with us, please, around that?
Yeah, so eating disorders affect pretty much every area of an individual's life when they're affected by it. Now, that might be hard to conceptualize for somebody that doesn't have an issue with food, because if you don't have an issue with food, although you eat several times throughout the day, you probably don't put a huge amount of thought into it.
Yeah.
But if you were to sort of break down in a day how much time we do spend thinking about or in relation to food or our bodies, we have to dress our bodies in the morning, we have to wash our bodies in the morning, we have to plan for food, eat food, clean up for food. There is quite a lot of presence of food and body in our lives. So if you have an issue with that, if you have an anxiety and a difficulty attached to it, that preoccupation becomes more and more, and it takes up more and more of a person's day. So it could be
Mhm.
that the person, if they've got a restrictive eating disorder like anorexia, is trying to plan for and maybe avoid certain foods or certain meals. Or it could be the opposite end of that, where the person is more preoccupied with gaining access to food and wanting to eat more food. And not just the mental health aspect, it also is the physical health aspect as well, especially if a person has been struggling for any length of period of time. Is eating disorders come with a lot of physical health consequences, more so than any other mental health problem, because of course food and your health are intrinsically related to one another in different ways. And I think what's often hard to talk about when we're just having a quite casual conversation as we are today about it, is that actually eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of all mental health illnesses because of that.
Wow. No, absolutely. And is if somebody is really struggling, what sort of signs should we be looking out for?
Hmm.
What sort of signs indicate that somebody might be really struggling with their relationship with food?
More often than not, people that struggle with eating disorders become especially skilled at hiding their eating disorder. There is a lot of shame attached to experiencing an eating disorder, and there is also a lot of stigma just in society around mental health in general, I guess.
Hmm.
And as a consequence, somebody could absolutely be really close to you, and yet you might be oblivious that they've got an issue, such as an eating disorder. However, some of the telltale signs might include, for example, them changing their relationship with food. Perhaps if you knew this person prior to the development of their eating disorder and their relationship with food starts to change significantly, that might include things like eating very differently, or that might include things like avoiding environments in which you might eat together. So, for example, not coming to a birthday meal or coming late so that they're not there for the eating part of something like that. Or that might be that even maybe in the break room at lunchtime, they avoid eating at the same time as other people so as to hide their food related behaviors. It could also be that you hear that they talk about food or body image or their weight far more than they used to, and that would be evidence of their preoccupation with it. But I think, again, going back to that stereotype that most people assume that somebody with an eating disorder is underweight, and that's not true. You can't know by looking at somebody, so it really is these far more subtle signs. And of course, there could be a whole raft of reasons why somebody's relationship with food changed. So I think
Yeah.
ultimately it has to come down to, if you've got any concern that a person's relationship with their self-esteem and their body image or their relationship with food seems to have changed, is doing the really brave thing and finding some time to ask them about it and being willing to potentially be wrong. But I think personally, at least, I would rather be wrong and ask somebody that question and then tell me that they were okay.
Yeah.
But them to know that it was okay to talk to me about that type of thing, rather than me to kind of collude with the secrecy element and the hiding of it,
Yeah.
and be scared to bring it to their attention that I was perhaps worried.
'Cause that is such a sensitive and a courageous conversation to have, isn't it, with somebody? But
Yeah.
would that be your advice on how to approach somebody you were worried about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a question that I get asked often. I would say more often than not, it's parents or spouses that reach out to me as a therapist and say, I'm concerned about my child or my spouse. How do I have this conversation with them in the right way? And I don't necessarily think there is a right way to have this conversation,
Yeah.
because this person is experiencing a mental illness, they're experiencing significant distress. Their eating disorder is their way to cope. Now, that might not make sense to you, but if this is primarily their only way to cope, they might be a bit defensive about you having that conversation with
Mm.
them. They might not be ready for you to have that conversation with them at the first point that you ask about it. But what I like to refer it to is opening the door. If you ask the question, you open the door and then leave the door open so that that person knows that they can come to you even when they do feel comfortable to have that conversation with somebody. Rather than, if that door's closed because you've never asked them about it, they're unlikely to find the courage to come and open it themselves to ask for help.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So let's think about somebody in veterinary practice right now.
Mhm.
If What sort of signs do you think would be useful to look out for? If you're suspicious about something, you're concerned about somebody,
Mhm.
would you start to maybe notice them they're not doing their job as efficiently or successfully as they used to? Or is there any sort of signs that people could really look out for?
Mhm. Well, as I indicated before, a person might actually hide it really well, and you might have absolutely no idea. I think that there's probably an issue in there that maybe contributes to people being scared to be honest about it, because they might be concerned about being perceived as not being capable of doing their job because they're struggling with a mental illness. Whereas, my years of experience would say the vast majority of people, unless they're exceptionally physically unwell, continue to be able to do at least some of their day-to-day things, and work is often good for somebody that's struggling with their mental health in terms of continuing to build confidence and relationships and those types of things. But what you might find is that the person starts to become a little bit less confident, a little bit more withdrawn, a little bit more unsure of themselves. Now, of course, again, all of those things might present themselves without an eating disorder. But I would say, if in any instance that collection of behaviours started to present, they're probably a good thing to have a conversation about, because it's clearly implying that the person is struggling with something. So I
Mhm.
think, generally speaking, we're just looking for those types of changes that are enough that you kind of get that gut instinct that something is off here,
Yeah.
and then being brave enough to have those conversations, and maybe letting the person know, hopefully letting the person know that you're not going to judge them as less capable because you recognise that they're struggling with something.
Hmm. Yeah, brilliant. That's great advice. Thank you. One thing we asked our community if they had any questions for us for this podcast, and we had a really interesting comment back around how busy it is in veterinary practice right now, and how it's very easy to start to skip meals because people just don't have time to take their lunch breaks or time to grab snacks. And one of the questions was, is it these sorts of behaviours that can lead to an eating disorder?
That's a great question. I wouldn't say that that type of work style is going to cause an eating disorder in the majority of instances. So, eating disorders are quite complex mental health problems that require multiple factors in order for a person to develop the struggle. So, we know that there is some genetic predisposition, and we talked a little before about that kind of temperament element to it as well, along with stresses in life. So, the average person that haven't we all at some point been too busy and skipped a meal at work is not going to develop an eating disorder in that type of environment. However, somebody with a history of an eating disorder is going to be quite vulnerable in that environment to potentially relapsing in their difficulties. And I would also say that it's going to be quite easy for somebody with a current active eating disorder to hide their eating disorder behaviors in a work environment where that's seen as quite normal to skip lunch and whatnot. So it's
Mhm.
certainly not optimum for people, but it's unlikely to be kind of the actual causative factor. And I guess I would want to, just in case this was a factor in the person, ask the question, reassure that person that you can't cause somebody's eating disorder by creating that type of work environment. And it is more complex than that, but it certainly is a concern.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. Are there things that employers can do to support somebody who discloses that they're struggling with an eating disorder? I know we've touched upon the fact it's a very sensitive conversation to have, but are there any things that you would recommend to employers, sorry, in particular?
hmm I think going back to what we just said about maybe the pressure of the veterinary environment and that potential to skip meals and things, I think they would be conversations it's really important to have with
Hmm.
an individual if there is a disclosure of an eating disorder, caveated with what I said prior to that, which was ensuring that the employee understands that you're not considering that they're incapable because they're struggling. That if they are having difficulties, hopefully you want to support them in that. And if it's not appropriate for them to be in work for some reason, you'd want to support them in that as well. But that their eating disorder can be accommodated, they can be supported.
Hmm.
And I suppose what we might want in an ideal circumstance is to have that conversation with the individual, because dependent on their eating disorder type, it's going to perhaps depend on the type of support that they need. But
Yeah.
things like having what we might refer to as protected meal times
Okay.
might be really important for that person. And also finding the time, which I'm appreciating is quite difficult, but finding the time to ensure that they're also regularly attending the appointments that they need to attend in terms of their medical care
Hmm.
and their mental health care.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, that's great. Thank you. And you'd hope that everybody listening is in a practice where they've got a great culture and great relationships with their teams, and have regular check-ins to check that they feel supported. But if there's people listening who maybe aren't quite at that stage with, or aren't in the environment where that's possible, is there anywhere where people can find more advice out or more support in this area?
Yes, absolutely. So you mentioned in your introduction to me that I'm an ambassador for BEAT, which is the UK's main eating disorder charity. So that would usually be the first port of call, I guess, for some introductory level information and or support. So BEAT's website is beateatingdisorders.org.uk, and they have a helpline that anybody can ring, really. That might be somebody with concerns about themselves, that might be somebody with concerns about somebody that they know as well, to get some signposting or some information. There's also some really helpful information on the website. Of course, I also have my own channels of information dissemination with the mentalhealthbites.co.uk website, which is mostly targeted more at a mental health and physical health professional kind of audience. So it's a slightly different level of information. So if you're just looking for that like access level information, Beat would be the best place. But if you were looking for a little bit more of the science, you might want to come over and find me. In terms of support, immediately, of course, you could access support via something like Beat's helpline. And people would obviously be welcome to reach out to me in terms of signposting to services, and obviously I myself offer therapy as well.
Wonderful. Oh, that's great. Thank you. And we'll make sure everything that you've mentioned, we'll put that on our blog as well, so people have got easy access to all of that.
Fantastic.
Oh, that's great. Well, we are very quickly running out of time, Kel, but are there any final comments that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I suppose what I would like to end with is, if you're listening to today's podcast and you're struggling, is reach out for help. We know that the sooner somebody accesses help and support, the better chance that person has of achieving a full recovery. So don't suffer in silence, access the help that you need, and it is possible to recover from an eating disorder.
That's brilliant. I think that's a wonderful place to end, Kel. Thank you so much. You shared some wonderful insights and advice there. And as I said, we will put everything on the blog. So if people are struggling, they'll be able to find all the information that could support them there.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, that's great. Thanks very much. Take care.